It's in the trees. It's coming.
Welcome to episode 28 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are beginning our Christmas season, exploring the origins of the British tradition of ghost stories for Christmas and discussing two films based on the work of M.R James. First up, we have Whistle and I'll Come to You, directed by Jonathan Miller and originally aired on the BBC in 1968. It stars Michael Hordern, Ambrose Coghill and George Woodbride. Then we follow this with another James adaptation, Night of the Demon from 1957, which was released in a truncated form in the States as Curse of the Demon in 1958. Based on the James story Casting the Runes, it was directed by Jacques Tourneur and stars Dana Andrews, Peggy Cummins, Niall McGinnis and Maurice Denham. Along the way, we'll be discussing the origins of the Ghost Stories for Christmas tradition, the works of M.R. James, the BBC series Ghost Stories for Christmas, and much, much more. Before all of that, though, as always, I'd like to begin by mentioning some of the key sources that I've used for researching this week's episode, and all of these, as usual, will be listed and linked in the show notes. So, when discussing the origins of the Christmas ghost story, I have referenced articles on the websites GothicHorrorStories.com, VisitSleepyHollow.com, SmithsonianMag.com, History.co.uk, DickensSearch.com, The Spectator, and the New York Public Library. For the section on Whistle and I'll Come to You, I have referred to an interview with Jonathan Miller that can be found on the website webofstories.com, articles on the British Film Institute website, an extract from the book No Digging Here, which can be found on headpress.com, and Wikipedia pages on M.R. James, Jonathan Miller, and the film itself. And when discussing Night of the Demon, I have referred to the book English Gothic by Jonathan Rigby, Jacques Tourneur, The Cinema of Nightfall by Chris Fujiwara, a paper called The Script, The Seance and the Censor, Making Night of the Demon by Alison Pierce, and that's available on whiteroseonline.com, and the Wikipedia and IMDb pages for the film and actor Dana Andrews. The tradition of telling ghost stories at Christmas time is a distinctly European one, and although we now tend to associate it with the Victorians, and in particular Charles Dickens, its roots reach much further back and extend across many cultures. Long before Christmas took on its familiar modern form, societies celebrated Yule and the winter solstice, festivals that were closely linked with the idea of the veil between the living and the dead growing thin. During the long, dark winter evenings, agricultural communities would finish their work early and gather round the fire, passing the hours by telling stories and spinning legends. Celtic legends told during the cold winter nights include tales of winter queens and kings of frost, as well as the great battle between the Oak King, representing summer and growth, and the Holly King, who embodied winter, darkness, and death. Over time, as Christianity took over, these became known as winter's tales, a term generally understood to mean stories of wonder, the uncanny, and the supernatural. They even found their way into the works of Shakespeare and inspired the title of one of his later plays. This is, of course, The Winter's Tale, written in about 1610, and in this one of the characters is asked for a story and replies, "A sad tale is best for winter. I have one of sprites and goblins." Even before this, we find a reference in a play by Christopher Marlowe called The Jew of Malta, written in 1589. And in this play, the character Barabbas says, quote, Now I remember those old women's words, who in my wealth would tell me winter's tales, and speak of spirits and ghosts that glide by night. End quote. Although the tradition never really made its way across to the US, and to be fair, it's not something that the Puritans would have taken across with them, it is mentioned in a series of Christmas stories written by Washington Irving. Written under the quite brilliant pseudonym of Geoffrey Crayon, his 1820 collection, The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, contains his most famous stories, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. But it also contains a series of Christmas stories set in the fictional location of Bracebridge Hall. These stories are nostalgic depictions of an old-fashioned English Christmas, viewed through the eyes of the eponymous Mr. Crayon. In these tales, he laments the decline of the traditional Old English festivities of wassailing, feasting and dancing, which by this time had indeed been all but forgotten. In the essay titled Christmas, he tells of people, quote, beguiling the long evening with legendary jokes and, I'm told, Christmas tales by the fire, while in the story The Christmas Dinner, characters gather around the drawing room fire and listen to the local parson, who is telling, quote, strange accounts of popular superstitions and legends. Irving's work was a direct inspiration on the writing of Charles Dickens. In fact, he said as much in a letter he sent to Irving in 1841, in which he wished that the two of them could travel to visit the fictional Bracebridge Hall together. A year later, in New York, Dickens made a speech with the American writer present, saying that he did not go to bed 2 nights out of 7 without taking Washington Irving's works under his arm, going on to say, quote, when all the ghost stories that ever were told come up before him, who does he think of but Washington Irving? End quote. There is little doubt in the mind of many historians that Bracebridge Hall was a direct inspiration for Dickens' own Christmas-themed works, and if we are to credit Dickens with the reinvention and reinvigoration of the Great British Christmas, then it's probably only fair that some of that credit also goes to Irving. But it is through Dickens that the long-standing association between winter, storytelling, and the supernatural became a defining feature of the season, something that was reflected clearly in his novel The Pickwick Papers. This was published in installments between 1836 and 1837, and there is a scene in which the central characters go and spend Christmas at the home of Mr. Wardle. After games, supper, and wassailing, the talk turns to fireside stories. Quote, everybody sits down with us on Christmas Eve, as you see them now, servants and all, and here we wait until the clock strikes 12 to usher Christmas in and while away the time with forfeits and old stories. End quote. And here, by the fire, Mr. Wardle's mother tells a frightening story of a goblin named Gabriel Grubb who gets carried away by a storm on a cold winter's night. A few years later, in 1843, we get A Christmas Carol, and then in 1850, Dickens published an essay called The Christmas Tree, in which he describes an ideal Christmas as, quote, there is probably a smell of roasted chestnuts and other good comfortable things all the time, for we are telling winter stories, ghost stories, or more shame for us, round the Christmas fire. End quote. Dickens was not only a writer, he was also a publisher, and the magazines he produced frequently included Christmas specials, and these heavily featured ghost stories by Dickens himself and a range of other writers. These magazines sold in their thousands and were intended to be read aloud in family circles by the fire, continuing the tradition that in reality stretched all the way back to the Celts. In fact, the tradition became so popular that it eventually became ripe for parody, and in 1891 the writer Jerome K. Jerome published his collection Told After Supper. This is a collection of rather satirical short stories, and much like modern anthology movies, it has a framing device concerning a group of people sharing spooky tales on Christmas Eve. Within the first few paragraphs, we get the line, quote, it always is Christmas Eve in a ghost story, end quote. And then, just a little later, quote, whenever 5 or 6 English-speaking people meet around a fire on Christmas Eve, they start telling each other ghost stories. Nothing satisfies us on Christmas Eve but to hear each other tell authentic anecdotes about spectres. It is a genial, festive season, and we love to muse upon graves and dead bodies and murders and blood. End quote. And it's probably also worth mentioning here that just a few years later, the writer M.R James would publish his novella The Turn of the Screw, a story that begins on Christmas Eve. Here, an unnamed narrator and some of his friends are gathered around a fire, leading one of the group to read the manuscript that becomes the main body of the story. And, as I've mentioned several times in this series, that novella, of course, was adapted into The Innocents in 1961, the Mike Flanagan series, The Haunting of Bly Manor, in 2018, and any other number of adaptations of admittedly varying quality in between. Small wonder then that this tradition was alive and well at King's College, Cambridge, finding an enraptured audience who, every Christmas, would gather around the fire to hear these stories told by the provost of the college, Montague Rhodes James. M.R James, or Monty for short, was born in 1862 in Kent and was the youngest of 4 children. From an early age, he was a prodigious reader and developed a fascination for antiquities, history, and medieval manuscripts, something that would go on to inform much of his later fiction. Like many of his class and generation, he was sent to boarding school at an early age, and then he studied at Eton, where he excelled academically. In 1882, he won a scholarship to King's College, Cambridge, where he studied classics and archaeology, and he became a fellow of the college in 1887. Just 2 years later, he was appointed to dean, and then in 1905 he became the provost, essentially the head of King's, until 1918. From here, he returned to Eton, this time again as provost, a role that he maintained until his death in 1936. Although James is now best known for his ghost stories, he was in fact one of the greatest medieval scholars of his generation, producing authoritative manuscripts for multiple libraries, including King's, the Fitzwilliam Museum, and several Oxford colleges. At one point, his discovery of a fragment of manuscript led to the discovery of the graves of several 12th century abbots that had been lost since the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII in 1541, and that's an event that really wouldn't go out of place in one of his stories. In fact, this expertise and fascination with antiquities forms the basis of many of his stories, which would often feature scholars and historians uncovering far more than they should. And these were first developed through his membership of a society known as the Chit Chat Club, or sometimes Chit Chat Society. This was a Cambridge discussion club that had been founded in 1860 and was composed of Cambridge University undergraduates and university staff. The club met on Saturday evenings, generally to discuss literary topics, but on the evening of October the 28th, 1893, they would discuss something very different. On this Saturday, 10 members and 1 guest gathered in James's rooms at the college and listened as their host read 2 original ghost stories, Canon Alberich's Scrapbook and Lost Hearts. Although this first reading was at the end of October, they would soon become an annual Christmas Eve tradition, where James would invite members of the club to his rooms at the university to have supper, and then, after the meal, hear one of his stories. One of the attendees at such a reading described it as follows. Monty disappeared into his bedroom. We sat and waited in the candlelight. Monty emerged from the bedroom, manuscript in hand at last, and blew out all the candles but one by which he seated himself. He then began to read. And it should probably be said at this point that M.R. James was not a believer in the supernatural, and that these stories were written very much as a piece of entertainment, or what he called a pleasant terror, rather than evidence of a disposition towards the paranormal. Often containing realism and dry humour, he redefined the ghost story for a new generation, abandoning the formal and Gothic clichés of many of his predecessors and developing a reputation as the originator of the modern ghost story, as well as being the father of folk horror. His stories are often set in seaside resorts, hotels, libraries, and cathedrals, and often centre around academics who do not know when to leave well enough alone, something that is perfectly described by the title of his story, A Warning to the Curious. According to James himself, his stories, quote, must put the reader into the position of saying to himself, if I'm not very careful, something of this kind may happen to me. End quote. His stories are often characterized by a very slow sense of creeping dread, and of some relentless and unspeakable evil from the past that once awoken cannot be stopped or avoided. He summed up his approach by saying, quote, 2 ingredients most valuable in the concocting of a ghost story are the atmosphere and the nicely managed crescendo. Let us then be introduced to the actors in a placid way. Let us see them going about their ordinary business, undisturbed by forebodings and pleased with their surroundings. And into this calm environment, let the ominous thing put out its head, unobtrusively at first, and then more insistently, until it holds the stage. End quote. He then went on to say that, in his opinion, the ghost should be malevolent or odious. For him, amiable and helpful apparitions were something more appropriate to fairy tales and local legends, and he certainly had no use for them in his stories. So, unlike the ghosts depicted in A Christmas Carol, Monty's phantoms are often demonic entities and are certainly very physical. They are vicious, hairy, slimy, and more often than not, caught just in the peripheral vision in the corner of your eye. His first story, Canon Alberich's Scrapbook, tells of a demonic entity that is attached to a scrapbook and which pays a nocturnal visit to the book's new owner. His second story, Lost Hearts, tells of a young orphan whose new guardian has some rather nasty intentions and whose home is haunted by the spirits of a young girl and boy. Quote, whilst the girl stood still, half smiling, with her hands clasped over her heart, the boy, a thin shape with black hair and ragged clothing, raised his arms into the air with an appearance of menace and an unappeasable hunger and longing. The moon shone upon his almost transparent hands, and Stephen saw that the nails were fearfully long and that the light shone through them. As he stood with his arms thus raised, he disclosed a terrifying spectacle. On the left side of his chest there opened a black and gaping rent, and there fell upon Stephen's brain, rather than upon his ear, the impression of one of those hungry and desolate cries that he had heard resounding over the woods of Aswarby all that evening. In another moment, this dreadful pair had moved swiftly and noiselessly over the dry gravel, and he saw them no more. End quote. Needless to say, these stories proved to be incredibly popular, and the Chit Chat Club encouraged him to get them published, resulting in his first collection, entitled Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, that was published in 1904. Across his writing career, Monty would write over 30 ghost stories, which in his lifetime were published across 3 more collections. These were More Ghost Stories of an Antiquary in 1911, A Thin Ghost and Others in 1919, and A Warning to the Curious and Other Stories in 1925. His works have been adapted for radio, TV, theatre and film, and he remains the single most influential ghost story writer in English literature. H.P. Lovecraft called him a literary weird fictionist of the very first rank, going on to suggest that he was, quote, gifted with an almost diabolical power of calling horror, end quote. His work has inspired countless other writers, including Peter Straub and Ramsey Campbell, and my personal favourites from his catalogue include Lost Hearts, The Ash Tree, Count Magnus, the Stalls of Barchester Cathedral, and the Mezzotint, all of which have been adapted and screened by the BBC as part of their annual Ghost Stories for Christmas. The BBC first introduced the Christmas ghost story on the radio, though this admittedly was not an M.R James adaptation, but was instead written by a man called A.J. Allen. This was called A Christmas Ghost Story and was about a motorist sheltering in a haunted cottage on Christmas Eve. The earliest James adaptation that I could find broadcast at Christmas was a 1954 reading of A Warning to the Curious, which was aired on the 10th of December, and this was then followed in 1957 by a reading of the story Lost Hearts on Christmas Day. And then on Christmas Eve 1963, the service broadcast a radio play of "O Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad." This was then followed by the TV adaptation that we are discussing first this week, although this was in fact not originally screened at Christmas, but instead at the beginning of May 1968. All of which then brings us on to the first of this week's movies, although admittedly at a running time of just shy of 45 minutes, it's actually more of a short. This is Whistle and I'll Come to You, directed by Jonathan Miller, and originally aired on the BBC in 1968 as part of their documentary series Omnibus. It stars Michael Hordern, supported by Ambrose Coghill and George Woodbride. And of course, now we are about to get into spoilers, so if you haven't seen this yet, given that it's only 45 minutes long, you have plenty of time to press pause, watch it, and then come back. The original short story by M.R James is very different to the BBC film version, so I'm going to begin with a summary of the original story, and then we're going to move on to the Jonathan Miller adaptation. O Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, to give the story its full title, was originally written in about 1901 and was published in 1904 as part of Monty's first short story collection. Taking its name from a poem by the Scottish poet Robert Burns, the story tells of Parkins, a professor at Cambridge University, who is described as, quote, young, neat, and precise in speech, end quote. Parkins is not only an academic, he is incredibly rational and deeply sceptical about superstition, priding himself on his ability to dismantle the beliefs of other people. In other words, he is a rather typical James protagonist. Very early on in the story, and with more than a touch of condescension, he announces that he doesn't believe in ghosts. And as the story continues, on several occasions, he expresses a very firm belief that every phenomena in the universe must have a logical explanation. I do not like careless talk about what you call ghosts, he says. A man in my position cannot, I find, be too careful about appearing to sanction the current belief on such subjects. His position is that he is a professor of ontography, which was, and I suppose still is, the philosophical study of being, existence, and the very nature of things. It is not a discipline that is interested in people or emotions. It is about categorizing being and dividing the world into tiny logical boxes. This field of study then really makes the point about the professor's character, and it's something that probably would also have raised a smile among the listeners at Cambridge University. When the story opens, he is about to embark on a golfing trip to a town called Burnstow on the east coast of England. Before he leaves, one of his colleagues asks him to look at the site of a Templars preceptory, which in plain English would have been the local headquarters of the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar were a medieval religious order of warrior monks who protected Christian pilgrims and also amassed a great deal of wealth and power during the Crusades. They were also an independent organisation who answered only to the Pope, so they were a combination of wealthy, well-armed and completely out of royal control. As a result, they were violently suppressed in the early 14th century by King Philip IV of France. The main reason for this was that Philip had borrowed an enormous amount of money from them to fund various wars with England, and so by destroying the order, he could essentially erase the debt and also seize all of their wealth. But naturally, King Philip couldn't really announce that these were his reasons, so instead the Templars were accused of moral corruption, heresy, blasphemy, the worship of strange idols, and obscene initiation rites. Not only were they accused, but many of them confessed, though admittedly, these confessions were of course coerced during torture. And even today, this reputation remains attached to their name, and the Templars have been used as antagonists in more than a few horror movies, including the Blind Dead series from Spain, directed by Armando Osorio in the early 1970s, and The Church from Italy and director Michele Soavi in 1989. The very mention of their name in Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad comes with a ready-made backstory, and Monty didn't need to expand on it at all to create a sense of atmosphere. On arrival at Burnstow, Parkins plays a few rounds of golf and sets off to find the preceptory. Once there, he discovers an ancient bronze whistle, half buried in the ruins. He takes it and makes his way back to the hotel, though notices, as he walks along the isolated beach, that he is not alone. Quote, "One last look behind to measure the distance he had made since leaving the ruined church showed him a prospect of company on his walk, in the shape of a rather indistinct person, who seemed to be making great efforts to catch up with him, but made little, if any, progress." End quote. When he arrives back at the hotel, he has dinner and then notices from the window somebody standing on the shore. He examines the whistle and discovers an engraving in Latin, which he translates to mean, "Who is this who is coming?" And then, of course, he decides to give the whistle a try. From that moment on, and for the rest of his stay, his sleep is disturbed by nightmares of a man desperately running and clambering over the beach. There is also scratching in the night, which he mistakenly believes to be the sound of rats, and eventually he encounters a ghostly figure made up of the bedsheets from the spare bed in his hotel room. This figure nearly succeeds in pushing him from the hotel window, and is described as having, quote, "an intensely horrible face of crumpled linen." End quote. The story was first filmed, at least as far as I can tell, in 1956. This was an amateur production by the North Downs Cinematograph Society, and this version was recently rediscovered and is available to watch on the BFI player. As an amateur production, it really didn't gain a lot of attention, and the first significant adaptation was the one that I mentioned earlier, broadcast on BBC Radio on Christmas Eve, 1963. A recording of the radio play is available on YouTube, and I'll also link it in the show notes. This version also stars Michael Hordern as Parkins, though this time the character is a little more faithful to the original text than the one we are discussing today, which was adapted and written by Jonathan Miller. Jonathan Miller, or Sir Jonathan Miller to give his proper and later title, was an English director of theatre and opera, as well as being an actor, author, TV presenter, comedian, and also a fully qualified doctor. He trained in medicine and specialised in neurology in the late 1950s, and during this period was involved in the Cambridge Footlights, a sketch comedy troupe run by the students of the university. An incredibly influential group, it has spawned a legion of comedians and actors. Former members have included John Cleese, Stephen Fry, Matthew Holness, Olivia Colman, Rufus Jones, and Richard Ayoade, to name just a few. During his time in the Footlights, Miller appeared in a number of review shows, and this led to his performing on radio and TV while still continuing his education. He gained his qualification in 1959 and then worked as a hospital house officer for 2 years, at the same time helping to write and produce the satirical review show Beyond the Fringe. This premiered at the Edinburgh Comedy Festival in August 1960, and as well as his own career, it also launched the careers of Alan Bennett, Peter Cook, and Dudley Moore. The show was a huge success and transferred from Edinburgh to London and then to Broadway in 1962, at which point Miller quit. In 1965, he took over as editor and presenter of Monitor, an arts programme on the BBC, and a year later, in 1966, he wrote, produced and directed an adaptation of Alice in Wonderland, again for the BBC. The idea for this adaptation came to him when he was watching a BBC quiz show, where one of the panellists was the poet John Betjeman. Quote, "He was talking about the ghost stories of M.R. James, and I was reminded of the grisliest of them all, Whistle and I'll Come to You. I knew that this would have to be my next film for the BBC." End quote. Miller, however, was not very interested in a straight adaptation, or indeed in telling a ghost story at all. In a later interview, he explained his approach by saying, quote, "I've never been too interested in ghosts. I'm interested in the sociology and the social anthropology of ghosts, of what belief in ghosts consists of, and what they represent in terms of mental constructs. That was very fascinating to me, and I took the story of M.R. James and modified it tremendously. It was an opportunity for talking about what it would have been like to have been a rational intellectual suddenly exposed to possibly his own fears of the supernatural." This, then, is very much an interpretation of James rather than a straight adaptation, and whilst the basic structure of the narrative remains intact, he certainly takes more than a few liberties with the central character. Performed by Michael Hordern, or Sir Michael Hordern to give him his later title, rather than the erudite and precise in speech professor of the source material, here we have a mumbling eccentric who seems to live a very internalized existence, one which, when viewed in hindsight, seems to suggest a form of neurodiversity. And at the time of broadcast, the publication Plays and Players picked up on this. They suggested that the character was suffering from a neurological condition called, quote-unquote, the idea of a presence. This was a term first coined by a neurologist called MacDonald Critchley and describes the sense that someone is just behind or near you when nobody is there. Critchley described it in his 1955 paper as, quote, "Sometimes the idea is vivid, sometimes it is subtle and ephemeral. In duration, it may be either sustained or transient, or yet again, it may repeatedly come and go, wax and wane. The identity of the visitant or presence is barely established. Usually the feeling merely entails the belief that there is someone in the vicinity, or the impression may not amount to anything more than an intangible feeling as if one were not alone." End quote. And given Miller's confirmation that he was less interested in telling a ghost story and more interested in what ghosts represent, it is indeed likely that the ghost here is a reflection of Parkin's psyche, something which is alluded to in the opening narration. It is a story of solitude and terror, but above all, it has a moral too. It hints at the dangers of intellectual pride and shows how a man's reason can be overthrown when he fails to acknowledge those forces inside himself, which he simply cannot understand. The focus, then, is less on the horrors of antiquity and the evils of the past, and more the horrors that come from within. To facilitate this approach, the narrative is compacted. We do not see Parkins at university, we do not see any exchanges with his colleagues or with his golfing partners. Indeed, this Parkins doesn't play golf at all. In addition, the cast of characters has been greatly reduced, and those that remain are barely coherent. The landlord of the inn mumbles so much as to be undecipherable, and the other guests at the hotel are just as uncommunicative. There is one minor exchange with a fellow guest that allows us to hear Parkins' views on the supernatural, though rather than the literary version's explanations, we get a rather confused and almost surreal response regarding the reality of Australia. Whether you agree with this approach and the characterization or not, it has to be said that Hordern gives a remarkably fine performance, relying on physicality and expression rather than dialogue and endless exposition. Much of the dialogue and performance was in fact improvised by Hordern, mumbling through meals, replaying back the words of others, and chuckling to himself at numerous internal monologues. Hordern, who by this time was a BAFTA-winning actor, had met Miller in the earlier part of the decade and later wrote of the experience that he had never felt so much freedom as an actor as he did working on this project. And although the characterization has come in for a fair amount of criticism from James purists over the years, the performance itself has been widely praised. Nowhere is the quality of his acting more clearly seen than in the moments where he sits silently in bed, listening fearfully, and in the final scene where, half terrified, he literally regresses to childhood, sucking on his thumb as his neighbours burst into the room. Filming took place in December 1967, mainly around the area of Dunwich, which sounds like Lovecraft country, but is in fact in Suffolk on the east coast. The ruins where Parkins finds the whistle are in fact real, and are the remains of Greyfriars Monastery, which was originally built in 1277. The monastery was dissolved in 1538, and while some of the ruins do still exist today, many of the original buildings were lost to the elements, coastal erosion, and storms over the centuries. Perhaps not surprisingly, the site is now reputed to be haunted, with legends of shadowy figures, phantom church bells, ghostly monks, and mysterious lights reported, particularly in the darkest part of the night between the 29th of September and Christmas Eve. The location of the Globe Inn was also in Dunwich, while the flat and seemingly endless beaches were filmed at Waxham Beach in Norfolk. All of these locations are filmed quite beautifully by director of photography Dick Bush, who had worked with Miller on Alice in Wonderland and who would go on to be a major contributor to British cinema. Following this, he would work with the director Ken Russell on several movies, including Tommy, Savage Messiah, Crimes of Passion, and the quite brilliantly insane Lair of the White Worm. He also worked with William Friedkin on Sorcerer in 1977 and on numerous British horror movies, including The Blood on Satan's Claw and Twins of Evil in 1972. His photography consists of very long takes which emphasize Parkins' isolation, particularly on the beach, with the shot of a motionless figure in the background, a brilliant sequence of understated menace. He also uses slight distortion, most notably at the climax, and superimposition and overlayered images, all filmed in a grainy black and white that has the quality of a nightmare. This approach is aided greatly by the editing, particularly during the nightmare sequence, as the spectral figure, in reality a manipulated sheet, undulates strangely and unnaturally across the sands. As well as the visuals, there is also the sound design, with the rustling of a sheet, the waves against the surf, and Parkins' footsteps, all emphasized to add to the sense of mounting horror. The film was first broadcast as part of the BBC's Omnibus series, a documentary arts programme which goes some way to explaining the factual voiceover at the beginning. It was repeated a year later, when a BBC press release described it as an unconventional adaptation, but also highlighted the quality of the actors' performances. Others, it has to be said, were perhaps not quite so kind. The writer Kingsley Amis was by all accounts highly critical and felt it to be a failure of an adaptation. Today, it gets a rather mixed reception. There are many who idolise it as a classic retelling of a classic story, and others who see it as something of a failure. The British Film Institute have described it as a masterpiece of economical horror that remains every bit as chilling as the date it was first broadcast, whereas Jonathan Rigby, in his book English Gothic, calls it a predictable catalogue of paranoid delusions. Still, it has to be said that whichever way you look at it, this adaptation is far superior to the 2010 reimagining from the BBC, which, despite the presence of the great John Hurt and the equally impressive Gemma Jones, is in many ways a total failure. Mostly this is because it has absolutely nothing at all to do with the James original other than the title. Had they not linked it with the original story, it probably would have worked as a standalone short about grief, dementia and guilt. So I think on this occasion, the filmmakers were rather hoist by their own petard. Although the Miller film was not originally screened as a seasonal special, over time it has been seen very much as a forerunner for the BBC series A Ghost Story for Christmas, that was first aired on December the 24th, 1971. This began with an adaptation of the James story The Stalls of Barchester Cathedral, which starred Robert Hardy as a clergyman haunted by guilt and something rather more unpleasant. And it's probably worth saying here that despite later commentators claiming that Miller's work was a direct influence on the series, Clarke himself claimed that he didn't see the film until years after he had made his own, something that he says was a very deliberate choice. The series came about, he says, not as a result of Miller's work, but instead from his own childhood, saying that ghost stories were very much a tradition in his family and that his dad used to read M.R. James to him when he was a child. He went on to say that he was desperate to make drama films and, thinking that the Christmas ghost story was a good idea for television, approached the BBC with the idea. To his amazement, the BBC said yes, leaving him with the job of writing, producing and directing a ghost story for the following Christmas, in between his regular duties as a documentary filmmaker. The first film was a success, and these stories became an annual event, continuing each year with A Warning to the Curious in 1972, Lost Hearts in 1973, The Treasure of Abbot Thomas in 1974, and The Ash Tree in 1975. In 1976, they broke with tradition and moved away from James, instead adapting a story by Charles Dickens called The Signalman. After this, the series continued for another 2 years, although with original stories rather than adaptations. There was an episode called Stigma in 1977 and The Ice House in 1978, when it finally came to an end. In December 1986, the BBC revived the tradition with a 5-part series called Classic Ghost Stories, which featured the actor Robert Powell reading several James stories directly to camera. They repeated this idea again in December 2000, this time with Christopher Lee portraying M.R. James himself, again telling several of the stories directly to camera. These, I have to say, are excellent and a fantastic way to while away a cold winter's evening, and I'm happy to say that currently, as of the time of recording, you can find all of them on YouTube. For Christmas 2005, though, the BBC returned to film versions of M.R. James stories, with adaptations of A View from the Hill in 2005, followed by a very good adaptation of Number 13 a year later in 2006. And then in 2013, the actor, writer and director Mark Gatiss took up the mantle, writing and directing adaptations of James, as well as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, E. Nesbit, and this year, E.F. Benson, himself an associate of James and another member of the Chit Chat Club. Rather unfairly, in my opinion, his adaptations often seem to get short shrift online, particularly among James purists and fans of the original 1970s cycle. In fact, this is now so much the case that for me the first sign of Christmas approaching is not a sprig of mistletoe or holly or even decorations in the shop. It is instead the sight of a load of M.R. James fans moaning about Mark Gatiss on Facebook. One M.R. James story that has not been adapted by the BBC, though it has been elsewhere, is Casting the Runes, which was first published in 1911. This was adapted by the ITV network in 1968 and again in 1979, and it's also been adapted several times for radio, including an early version by CBS in 1947. More importantly, though, this story is the basis for our second movie this week. All of which brings us on to Night of the Demon from 1957. This was directed by Jacques Tourneur and stars Dana Andrews, Peggy Cummins, Niall McGinnis and Maurice Denham. And again, here we are getting into spoilers, so although I'm not going to tell you the ending, I am going to give a fair amount away. So, as always, if you haven't seen Night of the Demon yet, please approach the rest of this episode with caution. The original story, Casting the Runes, concerns a character called Edward Dunning, a researcher for the British Museum. As the story opens, we discover that he has recently reviewed a paper called The Truth of Alchemy, written by a man called Carswell, an alchemist and a student of the occult. Unfortunately for Dunning, he is less than impressed by Carswell's writing and decides that the paper should be rejected. Later, when visiting a friend, Dunning begins to learn more about the mysterious Mr. Carswell, including the fact that a previous critic had ended up dead of a broken neck after attempting to flee a mysterious pursuer. Shortly after this, Dunning and Carswell meet by accident in the British Museum, during which encounter Carswell manages to slip him a piece of paper decorated with runic symbols. After this meeting, Dunning starts to experience strange and unsettling events, and as the story progresses, increasingly begins to believe that he has been cursed. Eventually finding the paper with the runic symbols, he decides that the only way to prevent his own death is by returning it to Carswell before it's too late. In the early 1950s, the screenwriter Charles Bennett acquired the film rights to the story from the estate of M.R James and began working on an adaptation. Bennett was an English playwright and screenwriter who began his career as a child actor, but got his big break when his play Blackmail was filmed by Alfred Hitchcock in 1929. This movie was the first British talking picture and was a huge success, and Bennett was offered a studio contract as a result, producing several stories and screenplays that were turned into low-budget British productions. However, it would be with Hitchcock that he would see his greatest successes. He wrote or co-wrote the stories and screenplays for many of the movies that would cement Hitchcock's reputation, including The Man Who Knew Too Much in 1934, The 39 Steps in 1935, Secret Agent in 1936, and Sabotage, also in 1936. This success earned him the attention of Hollywood, and in 1937 he was offered a contract with Universal Studios for a weekly salary of $1,500, which is the equivalent today of a weekly salary of $33,000. A very nice amount of money, I'm sure you'll agree, though it was one that the studio really couldn't afford to pay, as he explained in a later interview. Quote, "When I came over here, I was a complete flop, by the way. They immediately decided they couldn't afford to use me, and they loaned me out for a profit, which irritated me immensely." End quote. After 6 months, Universal dropped the contract, and he then went on to sign a new one with MGM, although again without much success. But things would change when Alfred Hitchcock asked him to work on the screenplay of his second US movie, Foreign Correspondent, and for this work, Bennett, along with other co-writers, was nominated for an Oscar. He continued his Hollywood career until 1944, when he returned to London to write wartime propaganda films for the British Ministry of Information. Once the war was over, he continued writing for both American and British productions, but he also had plans to direct, something that he achieved in 1949 with the British movie Madness of the Heart. By the 1950s, he had also begun writing for television, including the first screen adaptation of James Bond, Casino Royale, which was televised as part of the CBS series Climax. By the time he bought the screen rights to Casting the Runes, he had already written over 30 movies, as well as many TV shows, and had directed 2 feature films. And now, before we go any further, I think it's probably appropriate to address the elephant in the room, or should that be the demon in the trees? The common misconception about Night of the Demon is that there was never any demon in the original screenplay and that it was all added after the fact, and this isn't entirely correct. The early drafts of Bennett's adaptation had various working titles, including The Bewitched and The Haunted, and very importantly, while it didn't contain the exact demon that we see in the final movie, the screenplays did depict something. In fact, when the screenplay was first submitted to the British Film Censors in 1955, the censors had more than a little trouble explaining how the monster would be depicted, describing it, rather oddly, as a nebulous, horrible dinosaur. Later, when it was submitted again, it was described as a fleeting figure coalesced of smoke and flame, and the implication was that the film would be more about suggestion than depiction. However, as we all know, by the time of the film's release, everything was very, very different. The reason for this, it would seem, was the producer, Hal E. Chester, the man behind the giant monster movie The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, released in 1953, and one of the directors of Sabre films, who would go on to produce the final version of the screenplay. As I just mentioned, the script had already been submitted to the censor as early as 1955, and this was when it was attached to a producer called Marcel Hellman, who had been working with Bennett on the adaptation. On submission to the censors, they had been very disturbed by the occult elements depicted in the screenplay, particularly the seance scene that appears about halfway through. As regular listeners will remember, the British censor at the time was incredibly nervous about films depicting the occult, and this is something we covered back in episode 8 when we talked about The Devil Rides Out. Once the screenplay was submitted, the censor was absolutely clear. Given the subject matter, regardless of what amendments the writer and producer might make, the film would be given an X certificate. This meant that it would be restricted to an adult audience over the age of 16. As a result, Hellman backed out of the production, and Bennett, who had written it with the intention to direct, had to start all over again. Enter producer Hal E. Chester. Meeting Bennett in the UK, and shortly before the writer was due to fly back to the US, he offered him a contract, and Bennett, in a hurry to catch his plane, went ahead and signed it. Sadly for Bennett, when he got back to the States, he discovered that RKO Studios had also been interested in the project and were about to offer him a deal for the screenplay, with him attached as director. This, of course, was exactly what Bennett had always wanted, but it was too late. He had already signed a letter of intent with Hal E. Chester. And in signing that letter of intent, not only did Bennett unknowingly surrender an opportunity to direct the movie himself, he also signed it over to a producer who had very, very different ideas about how the story should go. For his part, Chester took credit for both the initial idea and the writing of the screenplay, saying that by the time of the initial meeting, he had already written a version himself, and that he had only given it to Bennett to break his treatment down into, quote, close-up, medium shot, long shot, and all that, end quote. According to his version of events, in exchange for this work, Bennett would be given the main writing credit, a story that seems incredibly unlikely, given that at the time, it was Bennett who owned the film rights to the story. But not only did Chester drastically rewrite parts of the script, and his name can be seen as a writer on the final credits, he also hired another writer to assist with further rewrites. This was a man called Cy Enfield, who had been blacklisted during the McCarthy witch hunts, and whose name, as a result, does not appear on the final movie. I think it's fair to say then that Bennett and Chester did not exactly hit it off, and Bennett would later recall that he had to sit by while Chester made, quote, the biggest balls up of a good script that I had ever seen, taking a major movie down to the level of crap, end quote. He then went on to say that as far as he was concerned, were Bennett to walk up his driveway, he would shoot him dead. Across the various rewrites, the demon moves from nebulous to a loathsome and bestial thing. And so although the common belief is that the demon was never in the screenplay, the reality is that it was always included, though it has to be said, far more subtly than the one we see at the start and end of the film. These scenes were indeed filmed and added after the fact at Chester's instruction and were not directed by Jacques Tourneur, who picked up the story in a later interview, saying, quote, the scenes in which you really see the demon were shot without me. All except one. I shot the sequence in the woods where Dana Andrews is chased by this sort of cloud. This technique should have been used for the other sequences. The audience should never have been completely certain of seeing the demon. They should have just unveiled it little by little without ever really showing it. They ruined the film by showing it from the very beginning. End quote. In a later interview, he expanded on this further, saying, quote, I wanted, at the very end, when the train goes by, to include only 4 frames of the monster, coming up with the guy and throwing him down. Boom, boom, Did I see it or didn't I? People would have to sit through it a second time to be sure of what they saw. But after I had finished and returned to the United States, the English producer made this horrible thing and cheapened it. It was like a different film." End quote. So there we have it. A demon was indeed always meant to be in the film, just a far more subtle one than the demon we ultimately got. And ever since the film's release, the debate over whether the monster belongs in the movie at all has continued. For my part, for many years, I was insistent that the film would be far better off without it. But I have to say that over time, I've grown to love the giant monster, and its image has certainly entered horror iconography. And well, it should. It's actually based on a 3,400-year-old print from an actual book on demonology. Being completely honest, what I'd really like is two versions, one with the demon and one without. But I suppose that's just me being greedy. With all of this background information, it's probably very easy, and possibly a little reductive, to label Chester as a terrible, terrible, terrible person, and there's at least one more story in that vein to come. But it has to be said that without him, the screenplay would not have found its way to Jacques Tourneur. Not having seen any of Bennett's direction, it's impossible to comment on what might have been, but I suspect it's doubtful that he would have come up with something as accomplished as the former Val Lewton collaborator who we discussed back in episode 21. Tourneur became involved in the movie after he was recommended to Chester by a mutual contact, and he brought with him all of these sensibilities he had developed over the years with Val Lewton, as well as the visual style he had honed directing film noir. In his extremely talented hands, and supported by the cinematography of Edward Scaife, the film gives us arresting image after arresting image, beginning with the very opening shot of a car driving through the woods at night, its headlights shining through the trees. It is my personal belief that this shot inspired a similar moment in the opening of Suspiria, though I have absolutely no evidence at all to back that up. Other impressive sequences involve Julian Carswell exiting the British Museum down a distorting corridor, signifying that our hero Holden has just been bewitched. And there's also a noir-esque shot of another distorted corridor, this time in Holden's hotel, as the runes begin to work their magic. In fact, being frank, the movie is set piece after set piece. There is a children's party with Carswell dressed as Bobo the Clown while a storm blows all around him, a walk through the forest late at night, a fantastic moment where members of the Carswell cult realise that Holden has been marked, and the suburban séance, in which the spirits are called by singing the song Cherry Ripe. This, of course, is the sequence that annoyed the censors at the pre-production stage, and it would also end up being sampled by Kate Bush for her single Hounds of Love. I could go on, but I think you get my point. Against these sequences and the slow build of mood and menace, it's no real surprise that Tourneur was less than happy with the depiction of the demon, which he felt belonged to a different type of film altogether. He was also less than happy about the editing of the scene with the panther in Carswell's study, which is indeed rather clumsy and quite possibly triggered memories of more producer interference around a panther from his time on Cat People. In addition to directing the film, Tourneur was instrumental in bringing on board Dana Andrews as the leading man, having worked together on the 1946 movie Canyon Passage, as well as being friends. Andrews had risen to fame in the 1940s, most notably for leading roles in film noir. These included his performance in the 1944 Otto Preminger movie Laura, in which he plays a detective who becomes obsessed with a murder victim. Despite the fact that some critics of the time described it as a triumph of style over sanity, it is an absolute classic example of noir cinema, and if you've never seen it, I highly recommend you tracking it down. Sadly, however, like several of the actors of his generation that we've discussed in this series, Andrews also suffered from alcoholism, something that became more apparent as the decade continued and which started to damage his career. By the mid-1950s, he was no longer a leading man and was relegated to B-movies, though he did experience a brief revival working for Fritz Lang on While the City Sleeps and Beyond a Reasonable Doubt, both in 1956. Night of the Demon, made a year later, would turn out to be one of his last major performances. After this, he would continue in B-movies and also move into television. And by the time of his death in 1992, at the age of 83, he had appeared in over 80 films and multiple TV series. Very importantly though, long before the time of his death, he managed to win the battle with his addiction issues. Following this, he worked actively with the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence, using his life experience as a teaching tool in an attempt to help others. In the movie, Andrew's character Holden is probably about as far removed from the original character of Dunning in the story as it is possible to get. The only similarity between the two is that they end up on the wrong side of Carswell. Dunning in the story is bookish, quietly rational and self-effacing, none of which we can say about Holden, who is brash, opinionated and arrogant. He probably has more in common with Peter Wingard in the 1962 movie Night of the Eagle than he does the original M.R. James character, and in fact we can see Holden as one in a long line of horror movie heroes who are brought very much down to earth after encountering the supernatural. And it's not just Carswell that he manages to rub up the wrong way. Joanna Harrington scolds him for treating her like a patient who has to be humoured, pointing out that she also majored in psychology. A fellow professor is equally critical, saying, quote, "I'm a scientist also, Dr. Holden. I know the value of the cold light of reason, but I also know the deep shadows that light can cast." End quote. Nevertheless, his arrogance continues apace, and he endangers not just himself, but also others. He turns on a light during the séance, despite the fact that it will be dangerous for the medium, and his spectacularly insensitive interference in the treatment of Rand Hobart causes the man to leap to his death. Although, to be fair, that may have more to do with his being injected with crystal meth than anything else. That sequence, by the way, is another stellar moment in the movie. Much like the character in Night of the Eagle, there is something incredibly satisfying about seeing somebody so overly confident brought down a peg or two, and this sense of schadenfreude is greatly aided by Andrew's fine performance as he becomes gradually more rattled and tries desperately to cling onto rational explanations. But despite Andrew's fine performance, if Night of the Demon belongs to anybody, it belongs to Niall McGinnis as Julian Carswell, a character who again is very different from the one we meet in the original story, and who here is given far more depth. The Carswell of the source material is evil through and through, a malignant force who delights in destroying his enemies. He also delights in terrorizing children, as we can see from a description of a magic lantern show that he puts on supposedly for their entertainment. Quote, "He switched on another slide, which showed great masses of snakes, centipedes, and disgusting creatures with wings. And somehow or other, he made it seem as if they were climbing out of the picture and getting in amongst the audience. And this was accompanied by a sort of dry rustling noise, which sent the children nearly mad, and of course they stampeded. A good many of them were rather hurt getting out of the room, and I don't suppose one of them closed an eye that night." End quote. Nasty stuff, and in sharp contrast to the Carswell we meet in the movie, who dresses as Bobo the Clown to entertain the local children, offers them ice cream, and who is also, quite clearly, terrified of the darkness with which he is playing. His attempt to hurry the doomed Harrington from his home is incredibly telling, and this is only emphasised further by an exchange with his mother, another additional character not in the original story, and played quite brilliantly, with no small amount of humour and tragedy, by Athene Saylor. "Listen, mother," he tells her. "You believe in the supernatural. I've shown you some of its power and its danger. Well, believe this also. You get nothing for nothing. This house, the land, how we live. Nothing for nothing. My followers who pay for all this do it out of fear, and I do what I do out of fear also. It's part of the price." All of this suggests that his explorations with magic are getting him in over his head, and that he is perhaps as much a victim of his own meddling with the dark arts as anybody else. Not that he is undeserving, though, of his ultimate fate. Not only does he use a demon from hell as an attack dog, which is the very definition of playing with fire, but as we learn from Rand Hobart, his corruption has spread to his followers. Calling themselves the true believers, they hold that evil is good and good evil, and that mankind can only find itself again through blasphemy, desecration, and the joy of sin. This sequence is no doubt the root of the comparisons between Carswell and Aleister Crowley, though it has to be said there is absolutely no evidence at all that the character was based on the notorious occultist. While Crowley had begun to attract press attention by the time James wrote the story in 1910, it was hardly at the scale where he had become a media bogeyman. Recent speculation has instead suggested that the character, in temperament if nothing else, is based on one of James's colleagues at King's, a man called Oscar Browning, suggesting that the characterization was more of a sly dig at a difficult colleague than it was anything else. This certainly seems to fit in with what we know about James's rather dry sense of humour. As for the screenplay and the movie, again, there is no evidence at all of Crowley being an inspiration, despite what many bloggers might suggest, though I'm sure his ego would probably have appreciated all of the renewed attention. Regardless of the inspiration, McGinnis manages to make the character both terrifying and pathetic, and also, importantly, very human, a sharp contrast to the magician McCarter in The Devil Rides Out a decade later. In this sense, both he and Holden feel more like characters from noir than they are from most horror movies of their time. Flawed and fragile figures trapped in a world that is beyond their comprehension or control, and hiding their insecurities beneath the mask of bravado. And rather than colouring their characters in black and white, Bennett, Tourneur and the actors paint them in shades of grey, producing a far more satisfying and engaging production as an end result. Night of the Demon was released in the UK in November 1957 and in the US as Curse of the Demon in June 1958. On its UK release, the Monthly Film Bulletin wrote the following, quote, "This essay in the occult is handled with much of the assurance of these same director's cat people and is well above average. Inevitably, the sequences where the demon takes on visible form are the weakest, especially in the ending, and seem rather the product of a child's nightmare than an adult's imagination. But the summoning of the storm, the experiences of Holden in Carswell's library and woods, and the rousing of one of Carswell's victims from a hypnotic trance are effective." End quote. In the years following its release, its reputation has only grown. It's yet another of the films we've discussed in the series that appears on Martin Scorsese's list of the 11 scariest horror movies of all time. It's also regarded as a precursor to the cycle of folk horror movies, and as an early example of occult cinema in the UK, it is a groundbreaking piece of filmmaking. Regardless of where you stand on the demon debacle, the visuals, the sense of impending doom, the conflict between science and superstition, and the fine performances from Dana Andrews and Niall McGinnis are all to be greatly admired. One can't help but wonder what Monty himself would have made of it. Whistle and I'll Come to You and Night of the Demon are of course connected through original writer M.R. James and the recurrent theme that runs through his work, that of rational and scientific individuals coming undone when confronted with the inexplicable. Both Parkins and Holden represent the concept of Apollonian man, embodying restraint, order, structure, and logic, a view that is soon torn asunder by the supernatural and the suggestion that beneath the surface, the world is far more Dionysian than they would care to admit. But whilst Holden and the Parkins from the original story are threatened by external supernatural forces, the Parkins of Miller's story is threatened from within, suggesting that the suppression of who we are and what is inside is the biggest threat of all. Regardless of whether you prefer the supernatural or psychological approach, the last words in this week's pairings should probably belong to M.R. James himself. Quote, "If any of my stories succeed in causing their readers to feel pleasantly uncomfortable when walking along a solitary road at nightfall or sitting over a dying fire in the small hours, my purpose in writing them will have been attained." End quote. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, and thank you very much for listening. If you have any thoughts or comments on either of this week's films or any of the films we've discussed in the series, you can write to me at thehorrorddoublebill.com. And if you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow the show on Instagram at thehorrorddoublebill. Our Christmas pairings will continue over the coming weeks, where at least one of the movies discussed will have some relation to the festive season, not least the notion of telling ghost stories by the fire. But before I tell you what is coming next week, a quick word about what lies ahead. Our Christmas episodes will take us up to and will include Sunday, December the 21st, at which point I will be taking a couple of weeks off. We will be back again in early January, but just some advance warning that there will be a small intermission between Christmas and the New Year. And with that being said, let's talk about next week's movies, when we're discussing our first anthologies of the series and the second horror movie I ever saw. This is Dead of Night from 1945, starring Mervyn Johns, Googie Withers, Sally Ann Howes and Michael Redgrave. And then after that, we are moving on to a film that, to be honest, has absolutely nothing to do with Christmas whatsoever, but it is another anthology movie and it's one of my favourites. So this is From Beyond the Grave from Amicus Studios and 1974. Directed by Kevin Connor, it stars Peter Cushing, Donald Pleasance, David Warner, Angela Pleasance, Diana Dawes, and a whole host of other fantastic British character actors. So, if you want to watch along, Dead of Night is available for rental or purchase from Amazon Prime, Google Play, Apple TV, and the BFI player. And From Beyond the Grave is also available from Amazon Prime, Apple TV, Sky Store, and also for rental from YouTube. So, I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you once again for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.